Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alistair Stevens. Tonight, we sing the song of creation. We bring the world into being as we consider the first part of J.R.R. Tolkien's History of Middle-earth and the Elder Days, the Silmarillion. Tonight, the Ainulindalë. This is the second time that I'm recording this week's session because, as planned, on Thursday night, I held the live session, and it was a ton of fun. It was an anarchic, hour and 3/4 that we spent looking at the Ainulindalë. Unfortunately, there were some audio problems, both in the live broadcast and then in the recording after the fact, that I just couldn't salvage, couldn't fix, couldn't repair, but also could not in good conscience release upon the world. So here I am, 2 days later. It's now Saturday evening in a windy night here in Oklahoma as I am recording the same material again. Thank you so much to everyone who made it to the show on Thursday. We had just a blast recording that. But this will be maybe a slightly tighter, slightly more focused version of the same material. And some of it will, of course, be different because way leads on to way and we exist in phenomenological time. So in a sense, I am not the same Alistair who recorded that show 2 days ago, which is heartening because it'd be a little dispiriting to have to do the same material over again. As much as I love the Silmarillion, as much as I specifically love the Ainulindalë. Before we get to that, I must unfortunately mention a couple of things which have become no less sad for the passing of 48 hours. January the 16th, 2025 was the 5th anniversary of the passing of Christopher Tolkien, who, as I mentioned in last week's show, I will leap at every opportunity to celebrate with respect and gratitude the work that Christopher Tolkien did. All of this is possible because of his rigorous academic approach to his father's work, and he is missed, unfortunately. It's a very sad, a long and happy life by all accounts. The last 45 years, I want to say, spent comfortably in France, but yeah, still a shame nonetheless. And if that weren't sad enough, January the 16th, 2025 also marked the passing of David Lynch, one of the few genuine geniuses that we will ever see upon this earth. I think that it would be entirely fair to say, entirely defensible for me to say, that I would not be here doing this kind of work. I would not think the way that I think about stories. I would not care the way that I care about stories if not for my early exposure to Lynch back in the 1990s. One of my absolute favorite directors, of course, of film and of television, a force of creative and generally artistic good in the world, I will say, and unfortunately taken far too soon after a life very fully lived, but nonetheless a shame. So you'll see beside me here on my counter tonight, Room to Dream, the David Lynch book, and of course the Silmarillion, the object of tonight's study. It's very sad to see so many of the people who formed my own sense of aesthetics, a topic about which I'll have a lot to say in just a moment here, finally passing. It's, perhaps we can only hope that this is the sorrow from which the beauty chiefly comes, to foreshadow an element of tonight's discussion and a very important theme in Tolkien's Legendarium. You'll also note that I am wearing these very uncomfortable headphones. This is to ensure audio quality for you, the listener at home. I hope you appreciate it. If you listened to last week's introductory session, you'll have heard me take a solid swing at defining a kind of interpretive approach that will serve us best for our exploration of and analysis of the Silmarillion. We're not reading the Silmarillion as homework. We're not reading the Silmarillion as an index to the Lord of the Rings. We're not reading the Silmarillion as a cipher for Catholic doctrine. That is not our intent. We are reading it in the spirit of collaborative and open-hearted readers so that we can better understand what it is that Tolkien is saying, not just about his secondary creation, but of course what else he believes, about his genuine perspective on life and art and on virtue and goodness. A lot, in fact, on virtue and goodness. So I wanted to take just a moment to circle back to a topic that I touched on lightly in last week's session, but which I would love to explore just a little more fully to better set the stage for our interpretive endeavor, particularly this evening as we look at the Ainulindalë. This is the slide from last week's reading. This is, of course, from the foreword to the first edition of the Silmarillion, published in 1977. Quote, "The Silmarillion is indeed the central stock of that great imaginative enterprise from which the Lord of the Rings was derived, for the elves were there from its beginning, and in them are to be discerned some of the primary aesthetic and philosophical convictions of the author." So, aesthetics and philosophy. And it occurred to me as I was prepping this session in the middle of the week that we might need to spend a moment on this because it's an interesting duality, even in 1977, and it's a fascinating one now, right? In our postmodern, self-branded influencer TikTok age, because, of course, aesthetics has always been philosophy. They are one and the same, but never more so than now. And we should look, I guess, a little at the beginnings of aesthetics, at the way that aesthetics develops as a discipline, because it does begin as a discipline. It begins as a philosophical branch dealing with beauty, with matters of subjective taste and objective artistic value, which is an incredibly loaded term that I would spend an hour on if I could. What makes something beautiful? What makes something ugly? What is the value of beauty? Ought there to be any value to beauty? What are the categories of beauty? How do we account for taste and preference? If there is such a thing as objective beauty, how are we to reconcile ourselves to the whims and fancy of subjective taste and desire, right? Preference. What does it mean, philosophically speaking, to say that something is beautiful, and how do we account for the moral obligations that are enfolded within our idea of beauty? That is to say that beautiful things ought to exist more than ugly things, right? Again, very, very loaded. This is a major feature of 18th century philosophy, primarily. It rises as a response to the all-consuming tide of rationalism, right? But what protests the aesthetic movement? What of taste? What of beauty? What of truth? What of the sublime? What, gentlemen, does your rigorous math make of art? Then, in the late 19th century, aesthetics takes on a new meaning, a more modern meaning, right? It becomes associated with this notion of the aesthetic, art for art's sake. The aesthetic becomes a goal in itself, really. This is formalized beginning in the 1950s into its modern usage, right? And I apologize to all the language prescriptivists out there because fundamentally that's not how language works. We adapt it to mean what we want it to mean. But the modern sense of aesthetic has its grounding there in the 1950s response to this late 19th century shift in meaning. And that takes us to our modern era, right? Our normcore aesthetic, our cottagecore aesthetic, our goblin mode aesthetic, all the things that are bandied around as hashtags all over the internet. So the notion of a specific aesthetic framework, right? The idea that an aesthetic can be defined and then replicated also gives access to this idea of the aesthetic as an identifying marker, as a badge of belonging or of consciously and deliberately not belonging to a particular social group, right? There's a sense in which our connective identity is expressed through these transactive symbols of identity and of belonging. So, you pick your aesthetic or aesthetics of choice, you replicate them or formalize them into your own identity, and that is a kind of badge of belonging for you specifically, right? It's giving fanfare, it's giving reputation era, I don't know. The reason that this works, the reason that I've invoked even tangentially Taylor Swift in a Tolkien podcast for perhaps the first time ever, is that aesthetics inevitably, inescapably betray a deeper and more fundamental philosophy, because the choices that you make integrating your own aesthetic sensibility tell us a lot about what you think is beautiful, what you think is good, what you think is moral, what you think is admirable in yourself and in others, and of course the opposites of all of those things too. And of course, when we betray those things, when we betray those elements of philosophy in aesthetics, we are also charging them politically, because you cannot talk publicly about what you believe to be good, what you believe to be moral, what you believe to be virtuous, without charging a certain kind of moral impetus behind those things, right? We should do the things that we believe to be good. We should not do the things that we believe to be bad, and we can externalize that out to everyone else too. So aesthetics is philosophy, is crucially politics. Why, for example, do I have my studio set up like this? Why am I worried about the fact that I'm wearing these ungainly headphones? Well, I'm worried about the fact that I'm wearing the ungainly headphones primarily because they are really quite uncomfortable. One of the disadvantages of being a bald gentleman, as I am, is that, the headphones just never either look good or feel good. But, it's a burden that I just have to bear. Why, though, am I sitting here in front of this bookcase arrayed with volumes which are meaningful to me? Well, it's partly because I want to cultivate the sense of a kind of genial erudition, right? Want to kind of give a Giles aesthetic to the whole proceedings, right? Giles, of course, always my favorite character because he's objectively the best character. That's how aesthetics works. That's how you hybridize the subjective and the objective, particularly within the frame of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, is that Giles is the best. See, philosophy's easy when you get into it. So I want to kind of cultivate this idea of genial erudition, but that is in part because I believe that genial erudition is a thing that one ought to pursue, that is a virtuous thing in the world, right? I would that everyone were a little more genial and a little more erudite. That seems to me to be a pretty universal good. So even my aesthetic choice in something as simple and ill-formed and insubstantial as this studio set is kind of leaning into that same idea, right? That aesthetics gets you to the heart of what the thing is about, to the philosophy of the thing itself. So all of this is to say that as we move through the Silmarillion, we're going to be paying attention to what happens. We're going to be engaging in close reading, right? What happens? When does it happen? Why does it happen? What causal connections can we extract from the specific text in front of us, right? That's a very good way of reading this kind of material. But we're also going to be looking at the aesthetic layer too. We're going to be looking at how the story is told. We're going to look at the registers that Tolkien moves between as he's trying to communicate the story, because there is as much story there and as much philosophy there as in the actual mechanics, the progression of the plot. We're not just going to be reading this as a strict and factual account of days and dates. We're not going to be looking at this just as a sequence of objective things that happen. We're also going to be looking at how the story is told. And one more thing to put in your heads before we get into tonight's session here. I'm going to switch slides because I want to talk a little more about myth and mythology, I guess. And I should disclaim this a little bit by saying that I come to myth, as I come to most things in life, from a narrative perspective, right? I am an expert on story. There are so many things in the world that I am not an expert on in any way to any extent. Sociologists talk about myth. Historians talk about myth. Psychologists talk about myth. There are many approaches to this thing, this giant thing, this fundamental creative impulse that is common to every human culture on Earth. Every single form of human community on Earth has myths and mythology, right? But I come to it from a storytelling perspective, and that gives me an understanding that there are functionally three kind of mythological modes. And I want to establish these early so that we can talk about the ways in which Professor Tolkien moves between these modes and integrates these modes, because the really successful myths have to exhibit all three of these, the sticky myths, the ones that endure in culture, the ones that endure even after your culture has fallen and faded. They're the ones that exhibit all three of these different modes at once. So let's call up this slide and talk a little about the etiological myth. That's the explanatory myth. There's a magic man who lives on that mountain and he throws lightning bolts when he gets angry, and that is where storms come from, right? We do not understand the world around us. We do not have a sufficient objective scientific explanation for why things happen, so we make up stories, we make up metaphors that allow us to understand intuitively what is going on. This is perhaps the earliest form of myth. On Thursday night, in the live chat, the fantastic Vinton Bain pointed out that Tolkien engages in this all through the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, of course, but particularly the invention of golf back in the Hobbit, where the goblin chieftain is struck, his head is struck from his shoulders, sails 100 yards through the air, goes down a rabbit hole, and that is how the battle is won and the game of golf is invented simultaneously, right? That is an etiological myth. I will note, too, that I have chosen, out of preference, the British AE spelling of etiological here. The Americans usually drop the A for reasons which defy understanding. If you have the opportunity to use the Latinid AE, why wouldn't you? So this is the foundational form of myth. The etiological myth is the explanatory myth. This has been adapted to a certain extent, I think, and I'm on speculative ground here. I'm not completely sure that this is true, but this is the thought that was occurring to me this week, is that in the modern era, etiological myths have become conspiracy theories, right? These are the stories that we tell ourselves and each other in order to explain a world that is far too complex to really, truly, comfortably comprehend. Is it possible that we are alone in the universe? Well, we lack sufficient scientific knowledge to say for sure one way or the other, but it seems unlikely, so we make up stories about government conspiracies and aliens. Actually, of course, there are aliens everywhere, and the government knows about it. It's just that they're keeping them secret for reasons X, Y, and Z. They're just saving them up so they can construct so many more pyramids, right? When there's a pyramid shortage, right? The government will unleash all of that alien pyramid building technology, then we'll have pyramids for days. It's going to be fantastic. Or that the world is run by a secret cabal of people who meet at the Bohemian Grove rather than, a complex and impossible to understand. I was trying to think of a simple word to convey like the magnitude of the impossibility of understanding the full magnitude of all the world's many interlocking systems. So we assume that is impossible. So we instead credit it to a small number of people who are, of course, operating in secrecy. Etiological myths become conspiracy myths. Etiological myths are effective and seductive because exactly that reason, right? Because the world is complicated and stories, crucially, are not. The second operative mode for myth is the morality myth, right? This is the story that tells you how you ought to behave. There's a magic man who lives in the mountain and he throws lightning bolts when people don't do as they're told, which is why it's important to do as you're told. The first function of any society is to protect its own boundaries, to order the behavior of its citizens, and to exile and alienate those who do not fit into that sociological model, right? So this is why vanity is bad like Narcissus, right? We have these illustrative examples. Pride is bad like Icarus. Greed is bad like Midas. The most important thing that we can do is instruct our citizens how to behave. The modern form of the morality myth, of course, is the fairy tale. It's a lot of juvenile fiction, really. It's an episode of Bluey, right? An episode of Bluey will give much the same instruction as the story of Icarus or the story of I'm just now wishing that there was a direct Bluey episode about Icarus. I don't think that there is. They've definitely crossed similar ground. I'll need to think about that a little more in my upcoming Bluey spin-off podcast, which I'm definitely not doing, but I could. If conspiracy theory is the modern etiological myth, and then juvenile fiction, children's stories, fairy tales in particular, well, let me hesitate there, because I think that there's another kind of modern morality myth that exists, and I think that it is found in celebrity culture, right? Kind of gossip columns. Who did what to whom and how are they being punished, right? Part of our appetite for that kind of material, which has like little to no objective value as news, right? Part of the reason that there is a hunger for those kinds of stories about who's getting together and who's breaking up and who's been caught with their hand in the till and so on and so forth. Part of the reason that we have that is that these are modern morality stories. We want to see that justice can also be exercised in a public sphere, right? We want to emphasize the idea, yes, the morality myth teaches you how to behave, but if you don't behave, you are going to be punished. And if you do behave, you will be rewarded, right? We also want that side of things too. Then we have, perhaps from my perspective, the most important narrative mode, the mythological mode that we can be in, the narrative mode, right? The narrative myth is the entertaining myth. Myths have to be entertaining to be sticky. The more entertaining they are, the higher order the rhetoric associated with this myth, right? The more melodramatic, the more extreme, the more intense, then the stickier the myth will be. There's a magic man who lives in that mountain and he throws lightning bolts when he's angry at people aren't doing as they're told, and it's awesome, right? The awesomeness is an important factor. You can tell the story of Icarus compressed as Icarus didn't listen to his dad about tying his sandals because he thought he knew better. Then one day he tripped and he banged his head, and you know where he is now? Nowhere, because he's dead. Well, I mean, that's the same story. It's not as good. It's not as juicy, right? It's lacking any kind of etiological element, and it's lacking a real kind of bombast. It's lacking a scale. And this is something at which Tolkien is an absolute master, right? The idea that we have to modulate the scale of our story, that we have to modulate the tone of our storytelling in order to encompass magnitude. This is where Tolkien lives. This is just the strongest thing perhaps about any of his books. Okay, so let's consider etiological myth, morality myth, narrative myth. Let's consider aesthetics. Let's consider philosophy. Let's consider the way that those two things combine to give us a sense of the political. And then let's get into it. Let's talk about the Ainulindalë itself. Let's move into probably the shortest slide I am ever going to use here, because I want to talk a bit about the title, the Ainulindalë. It is doing a significant amount of heavy lifting, particularly in the absence of the framing story. I touched on this a little last week, and I will probably, I think, maybe even this week, do a short bonus episode on the framing story that Tolkien envisioned for his entire legendarium. That is, the account that explains how these tales of elder days passed into his hands, right? Actually Tolkien's hands. How the stories come out of the West, how the stories are passed from the elves into the hands of man, how they move through the ages, and how they come to Tolkien himself so that he can, transcribe them, adapt them to a certain extent, translate them in certain parts, and then publish them, right? That's always a conscious part of his creative process, even as he's writing the earliest parts of the Legendarium. That falls out of the Silmarillion. Christopher Tolkien later said that he regretted not including it, but he made the choice he made. He didn't include it. So we begin this book with this foreword. If you're reading the second edition, you begin with a letter to Waldman. You get like a lot of the sense of Tolkien as a writer. He's extremely present in the opening pages of this volume, but then crash, you're into the Ainulindalë. And the fact that it is just called the Ainulindalë immediately anchors us in a particular and specific time and place, because Ainulindalë is a Quenya word, right? We know then that this is the accounting of the elves, but it takes a line or two to realize that this is not a story about the elves. This is the elves' retelling of their own creation myth as we learn at the end of this section, as taught to them by the Valar in the years after the elves awakened in Arda, right? So this is the deep history of the people who tell this story to the elves, and this creates space for metaphor and interpretation. It limits our knowledge in a really interesting way. We'll talk more specifically about that as we move into it, but I think that that anchoring this in the elven perspective on the Valerian perspective on the Ainurian experience, right, is very conscious, it's very deliberate, and it creates immediately these layers of text and paratext, right? We're not getting a first-person immediate account. This is not a primary source for the historians among you. This is a story that has been relayed, and in that relaying, choices have been made, right? We'll look on that very carefully as we move into it. The typeface that I've used here, by the way, is Tengwar Artano, which is available out there on the internet. I will link to it in the show notes. It's a particularly beautiful version. Of course, Tengwar, created by Professor Tolkien, again, right, outside of the fiction, within the fiction, by Feanor. But outside of the fiction, Tolkien creates this language, but there are multiple modern versions of it that can be freely used on your computer that kind of stress and identify different virtues contained within the script. They are the same letters, right? In the same way that you would use different fonts on your computer, just using the Latin alphabet that we use all the time here in English. There are different versions of Tengwar that you can use for different purposes, right? There is, I'm sure, somewhere out there, a Tengwar comic sans. So, the Ainulindalë. Ainur, the Holy Ones, Lindale, music or singing, you see here very common in this period of Tolkien's creativity, very common in his treatment of the Elvish languages. That little umlaut there, that little diacritical mark above the E, demonstrating that that is where emphasis should go, right? The Ainu, the Ainur, right? The Ainulindalë. That's where the emphasis, we should expand that as a syllabic sound and not, this is not the, I'm breaking my brain even trying to formulate how you would say it. The Ainulindalë would be very bad. Yeah, the Ainulindalë. So let's take a look at the beginning. Let's get into it then here. I cannot believe 25 minutes into this recording, I am just now beginning the Silmarillion. Quote, "There was Eru, the One, who in Arda is called Ilúvatar, and he made first the Ainur, the Holy Ones, that were the offspring of his thought, and they were with him before aught else was made. And he spoke to them, propounding to them themes of music, and they sang before him, and he was glad. But for a long while they sang only each alone, or but few together, while the rest hearkened, for each comprehended only that part of the mind of Ilúvatar from which he came, and in the understanding of their brethren they grew but slowly. Yet ever as they listened, they came to deeper understanding, and increased in unison and harmony. And it came to pass that Ilúvatar called together all the Ainur, and declared to them a mighty theme, unfolding to them things greater and more wonderful than he had yet revealed. And the glory of its beginning, and the splendor of its end amazed the Ainur, so that they bowed before Ilúvatar and were silent. Then Ilúvatar said to them, Of the theme that I have declared to you, I will now that ye make in harmony together a great music, and since I have kindled you with the flame imperishable, ye shall show forth your powers in adorning this theme, each with his own thoughts and devices, if he will. But I will sit and hearken, and be glad that through you great beauty has been wakened into song." This is, just outstanding. I cannot say enough good things about the opening of this story. It is absolutely what I was talking about Tolkien operating at this gargantuan, magnificent rhetorical mode, right? This is the highest possible rhetorical order that he can bring to this story, and it is resonant. It is magnificent. It is poetry, right? It is poetry in prose. Let's begin then by breaking down a couple of terms that are presented to us here, because they give us a certain insight into what Tolkien can do here, right? What his intent is, and the trick that he's playing, the mythological, the mythopoetic maneuver that he is exercising here, which is just fantastic. Eru Iluvatar, right? Eru meaning one or alone or solitary here. Iluvatar, who in Arda is called Iluvatar, just means father of all or all father, right? A pretty common name applied to the chief god in a given pantheon, right? Odin is the All-Father, Zeus is the All-Father, Jupiter is sometimes the All-Father, though Jupiter also goes by the much more fantastic Optimus Maximus, because if you're the boss of all the gods, you get to be named after a transformer, I guess. That's pretty cool. Arda in Quenya just means realm or place, right? It is the name for the earth in a sense. Yeah, I guess we'll talk about this right now, because otherwise I might forget, and that would be terrible. Arda means the earth. It means the world. But it also means the universe, but also the phrase kingdom of Arda is used to mean the entire universe, and Arda is used to mean the earth, except that sometimes it seems as though kingdom of Arda means just the planet itself. It's a little complicated, right? But Arda is, we might think of it as all of creation anchored in a singular planet. There is, space and stars and celestial bodies, but it's a little bit complicated to pin down exactly what he means, and it seems to be something that Tolkien had changed his mind about as he was moving through the Legendarium. I'm not completely sure. I would need to refer back to the pages of the History of Middle-earth to be absolutely certain about how this evolves, but we can basically think of it in the medieval sense in particular, right? In this kind of geocentric conception of the universe, that it means the planet and by extension the celestial spheres around the planet, right? All of space, all that there is, but really we're talking about the planet at the heart of that complicated orrery, right? The other thing that we should probably clarify here is the flame imperishable, and I'm kind of loath to do this because I don't want necessarily to skip too far ahead. As far as possible, I want to take the book as the book is presented to us, but it really helps to jump ahead a little and get access to this underlying idea of the flame imperishable. The flame imperishable might be thought of as Iluvatar's creativity, right? It is the creative spark. It is that thing which allows him to kindle being in others. Without that, nothing is real. Without being kindled by the flame imperishable, or as I insisted on reporting on Thursday night, kindled by the flame imperishable. A joke for those of you who made it to the live session on Thursday. Without that, there is no sense of being, right? This is primary creation and secondary creation. We'll talk more about that as we get into the creation of Arda itself, but that is what the flame imperishable is, what it allows Iluvatar to do. Its exact relationship as a distinct thing from Iluvatar is interesting, right? But we'll come back to that in just a moment. But that it is that power of creation itself. It is also one and the same with the secret fire, right? Which you'll remember that Gandalf proclaims to the Balrog that he is a servant of the secret fire, right? That is that same power of not just life, but existence, of being. We'll talk about that as Arda is created. So, what is happening in this opening passage? There was Eru, the one who in Arda is called Iluvatar, and he made first the Ainur, the Holy Ones. So, we must not fall into the trap of reading this strictly as allegory. We must not fall into the trap of trying to immediately map these beings onto beings which are more familiar to us from other mythologies or other spheres of metaphor, right? Iluvatar is not the Christian god, exactly, though that is perhaps the closest match that we're ever going to make in the pages of Tolkien to something which exists in the real world. Let me frame that out just a little bit right here. Part of Tolkien's creative maneuver here, it seems to me, is to allow himself the synthesis of the classical modality in which he enjoys creating stories and the medieval modality in which he enjoys creating stories, right? The classical pantheistic approach to fantasy and the medieval Christian approach to fantasy, right? You'll remember that he doesn't want to tell strictly Christian stories because they are inauthentic to this deep history, this pre-Christian history of England. He wants to account for the existence of pagan pantheistic religions in England in the elder days. That's part of the mythological framework that's being presented to us here. So he executes this fantastic, not even a rhetorical maneuver, right? This mythopoetic maneuver in which he establishes Eru, the One, who in Arda is called Iluvatar. Does he have other names in other places? Are there other places beyond the realm of Arda, right? This is an interesting thing. He is singular. He exists beyond the frame of this creation. I think it's pretty fair to map Eru directly to the Christian God, to the Catholic God that Tolkien believed in. I think that, as a singular creative force, I think that is kind of okay. I think we're almost allowed to do that, right? With asterisks attached. What we cannot do, though, is look at the Ainur as something else that fits inside of a Catholic doctrine, because it doesn't, right? The Ainur are not angels. The Ainur are not demigods. They are themselves gods. In earlier drafts of this story, Tolkien referred to the Ainur as gods and the elves as fairies, right? He's operating in a much more classical mode. Here he gets to have his cake and eat it too. He gets to absolutely respect and establish this monotheistic power, his most fundamental belief, cosmologically speaking. He gets to establish this monotheistic power, but also this pantheistic power too, right? He gets to look at how the Ainur operate here as gods themselves, right? But we're not going to think of them as gods. And we're not going to think of them, as I say, as angels. We're going to think of them as the Ainur. They are themselves specific. He is not just cribbing, the Greek pantheon or the Roman pantheon or the Norse pantheon. He is creating something absolutely new. And if we try to take shortcuts to our understanding, if we try to skip ahead and say, oh, well, this figure maps directly to this figure, we're going to miss basically everything that makes this book special, basically everything that makes this book unique, everything that really gives us insight into Tolkien's perspective on the world. So there is Iluvatar. He makes the Ainur. They were with him before aught else was made, right? So there's nothing else in the universe. There isn't even a universe. There's nothing else that has been created save for the Ainur. He gives them these themes of music and they sing before him and he is glad, but because they comprehend, only that part of the mind of Iluvatar from which he came, and in the understanding of their brethren they grow but slowly, they sing largely alone or in small groups. They are not yet unified. They are individual. They each embody that aspect of Iluvatar from which they were created, right? There is this fragmented incarnation of self, right? Iluvatar is all that there is. There's nothing else but him. So everything that is created has to be, to some extent, a reflection of him. It has to be a part of him. It has to be an extension of him, as the Ainur are. Each springs from a particular part of his mind, and they understand that part of his mind. And then it's only through the listening to the singing of others and the singing together, slowly over time, the singing together, that they come to understand the other aspects of Iluvatar's mind, right? This is the mind seeking to understand itself. It's this ongoing reflexive process that betrays, right? This is an aesthetic choice that Tolkien is making here. This is a mythopoetic choice, certainly, but it is an aesthetic choice that Tolkien is making here that is betraying this deeper philosophy and thereby deeper politics. Diversity is good. Diversity is valuable. That we should have different voices raised in song, because through those different voices raised in song, we discover truth and we discover beauty that was not there before. Even Iluvatar himself, right? They sing and he is joyful. Through you, great beauty has been wakened into song. So they sing a part at first, and then he declares to them this theme. You'll note Iluvatar does not sing. This is important. Iluvatar does not make the music, the music of the Ainur. He propounds to them this theme and says, of this theme that I have declared to you, I will now that you make in harmony together a great music. Perfectly normal, right? A perfectly normal thing that a god can say to his creation, right? I am God, I created you, you will do this thing that I have commanded and it will be, capital G, good. But that's not what Iluvatar is doing exactly here. Since I have kindled you with the flame imperishable, ye shall show forth your powers in adorning this theme, each with his own thoughts and devices, if he will. All of this is important, right? Because I have brought you into being, because you are yourselves real, in whatever way you are real at this point before the creation of the universe, you will show forth your powers in adorning this theme, each with your own thoughts and devices. You are going to bring yourself to this theme that I have propounded to you, and in the so doing, it will become more beautiful. And not just that, not just that you will improvise on this theme that I have given you, but you don't have to. If he will, you don't have to do this, right? I have given you free will. I have given you autonomy. That is where this music will derive its beauty from, in part, right? This is where this music will derive its beauty from, is from the free will of everyone who is creating it. And that is crucial because we're going to look at what happens with Melkor, and it's often said that Melkor tries to exert free will, and that's simply untrue. That is not the problem. That is not the problem with Melkor, alternate title for tonight's session. So let's take a look then at the performance of the Ainur. Then the voices of the Ainur, like unto harps and lutes and pipes and trumpets and viols and organs, and like unto countless choirs singing with words, began to fashion the theme of Iluvatar to a great music, and a sound arose of endless interchanging melodies, woven in harmony that passed beyond hearing into the depths and into the heights, and the places of the dwelling of Iluvatar were filled to overflowing. And the music and the echo of the music went out into the void, and it was not void. Never since have the Ainur made any music like to this music, though it has been said that a greater still shall be made before Iluvatar by the choirs of the Ainur and the children of Iluvatar after the end of days. Then the themes of Iluvatar shall be played aright, and take being in the moment of their utterance, for all shall then understand fully his intent in their part, and each shall know the comprehension of each, and Iluvatar shall give to their thoughts the secret fire, being well pleased. Wow. So this is where it becomes clear. I think it's interesting having looked at, I should also acknowledge an email that I received this week from James, who asked, since the readings for the Silmarillion series are going to be so short, will I be using every single word on a slide? And the answer is no, but basically yes. I don't think I've cut much from the Ainulindalë from tonight's session, so we still have a long way to go. Let's get into it. So this is where the metaphorical layer becomes clear, right? This is where the perspective of the elves who are reporting this story from the Valar, of their memories of the Ainur and the act of creation itself, this is where that text and paratext layer becomes significant because, well, we're already deep into metaphor, right? The idea of singing isn't really what the Ainur were doing, presumably, right? We can maybe credit it that in some sense they were actually singing, they were actually making music, but they weren't making music like this, right? Like unto harps and lutes and pipes and trumpets and viols and organs, and like unto countless choirs singing with words. So there is singing, but it's not actually singing, and there are instruments, but they're not actually instruments. This is, explicitly metaphor here, right? And then we pivot still further as the music is created and the void is not void. Never since have the Ainur made any music like to this music, though it has been said that a greater still shall be made before Iluvatar by the choirs of the Ainur and the children of Iluvatar after the end of days. We are repositioning this story to incorporate the elves. The elves haven't yet appeared in the story. Elves and man, I should say, all children of Iluvatar. But we're repositioning the story and the intent of the story very close to its beginning, right? We outline exactly how we get to the music, and then parenthetically, they haven't done this again. This was the only time that it happened. And it's a complicated process, too. Performance in free will, though, we'll note that, right? They lift up, they begin to fashion the theme of Iluvatar to a great music. The sound arose of endless interchanging melodies woven in harmony that passed beyond hearing into the depths and into the heights. They are all of them equally improvising. They are all of them equally contributing their thought to the music. At least we say all of them. We assume all of them. There isn't really an accounting of the sulky Ainur who don't join in the music because it isn't their preferred. They're just really big into European electropop and this whole choral arrangement that the Ainur are doing, not really to their taste, so they can't set this one out. But it's still important that Iluvatar credits them with the free will to not join if they would choose not to, right? So what happens at the end of days, or what happens after, crucially, the end of days here? Then the themes of Iluvatar shall be played aright and take being in the moment of their utterance, for all shall then understand fully his intent in their part, and each shall know the comprehension of each, and Iluvatar shall give to their thoughts the secret fire, being well pleased. What is the secret fire? Oh, it's being, it's existence, right? They will take being in the moment of their utterance. Someday, after the end of days, after whatever is being created here has ended, we're going to do it again, and we're going to do it properly. So we're already anticipating the fact that something is about to go wrong. We're already anticipating that this great music is going to lead, right? We've established that this is a creation myth. This great music is going to lead somehow to the world, but that it is imperfect. We're acknowledging that imperfection before we even get the process of imperfecting on the page, right? Before we even see Melkor's dissonance. I want to, let's take a quick look. I pulled the, we talked already a little about this. Let's skip over it very quickly here because I pulled part of the letter to Milton Waldman from the second edition of the Silmarillion just to call out exactly what Tolkien is doing with the Ainur themselves, right? Quote, the cycles begin with a I could not pronounce this word on Thursday and I cannot pronounce it now. Cosmogonical. The cycles begin with a cosmogonical myth, the music of the Ainur. God and the Valar, or powers, Englished as gods is not an inappropriate term here, are revealed. These latter are, as we should say, angelic powers, angels are not inappropriate here, whose function is to exercise delegated authority in their spheres, of rule and government, not creation, making, or remaking. They are divine, that is, were originally from outside and existed before the making of the world. Their power and wisdom is derived from their knowledge of the cosmogonical drama, from, which they perceive first as a drama, that is, in a fashion we perceive a story composed by someone else, and later as a reality. On the side of mere narrative device, this is, of course, meant to provide beings of the same order of beauty, power, and majesty as the gods of higher mythology, which can yet be accepted, well, shall we say boldly, by a mind that believes in the Blessed Trinity. So really calling out that point that I was making earlier, right? That this is Tolkien having his theological cake and eating it too. Is the world, is the universe monotheistic? Yes, it is. Is it also pantheistic? Yes, it is. Excellent. Two great tastes that taste great together. But it's important here to recognize the limits that he's putting on that authority, on the authority of the Ainur themselves, right? On the power of the Ainur themselves. They have delegated authority in their spheres, right? Within the area that is governed by the part of the mind of Iluvatar which created them in the first place, they have a certain kind of authority, of rule and government, but not, crucially, creation. And all of this is happening, of course, in the shadow of Tolkien's excellent poem, Mythopoeia, where he talks about the principles of creation and secondary creation. And I'm kind of skipping over that because I'm assuming that if you are listening to this podcast, you have probably heard someone, probably me, talk about this in the past. But let's gloss it for anyone who's coming in fresh to the Silmarillion. The only creative power is the flame imperishable. The only being that can create is Iluvatar. No other being is capable of creation in any order. They are only, as Tolkien says in Mythopoeia, prisms reflecting and refracting the light of God. All creation comes from God, and we, artists that we are, just channel that light in particular ways, in particular directions. But that is all that we can do. The thing that we create, the subcreation, is never going to be creation. It's never going to be on the same level as that which has been created by God. It by definition cannot be. Now, what's interesting here is that Tolkien is establishing this monotheistic, pantheistic duality, but he is also limiting the power of the Ainur. He is subordinating them beneath Iluvatar's creative power, right? That is what gives Iluvatar a special condition of being, right? That is what makes Iluvatar, in some sense, above the Ainur, is that it is only Iluvatar that can create. He creates the Ainur. The Ainur themselves then cannot create. They can only reflect his light. They can channel his creation. Let's take a look at what happens then with Melkor. Quote, "But now Iluvatar sat and hearkened, and for a great while it seemed good to him, for in the music there were no flaws. But as the theme progressed, it came into the heart of Melkor to interweave matters of his own imagining that were not in accord with the theme of Iluvatar, for he sought therein to increase the power and glory of the part assigned to himself. To Melkor among the Ainur had been given the greatest gifts of power and knowledge, and he had a share in all the gifts of his brethren. He had gone often alone into the void places seeking the imperishable flame, for desire grew hot within him to bring into being things of his own, and it seemed to him that Iluvatar took no thought for the void, and he was impatient of its emptiness. Yet he found not the fire, for it is with Iluvatar. But being alone, he had begun to conceive thoughts of his own unlike those of his brethren. Some of those thoughts he now wove into his music, and straightway discord arose about him, and many that sang nigh him grew despondent, and their thought was disturbed, and their music faltered. But some began to attune their music to his, rather than to the thought that they had had at first. Then the discord of Melkor spread even wider, and the melodies which had been heard before foundered in a sea of turbulent sound. But Iluvatar sat and hearkened until it seemed that about his throne there was a raging storm, as of dark waters that made war one upon another in an endless wrath that could not be assuaged. So Melkor's a conundrum. Melkor, the greatest and most multidisciplinary of the Ainur, he has often gone into the void seeking the flame imperishable, right? Again, we're acknowledging here the metaphorical layer. How has he gone into the void? Like, if the void is the absence of anything, then how has he done so? What is it exactly that he is seeking? What does it mean to even travel in space before the creation of space? What does it mean before, right? If time does not exist, we have no reason to believe that we haven't seen every single event that has happened since the creation of the universe here contained within these pages, but we're told, no, secretly before all of this, Melkor went off and was scuttling around looking for the flame imperishable. And there's something weird about cause and effect happening here too, right? He goes off into the void seeking the flame imperishable, for desire grew hot within him to bring into being things of his own, and it seemed to him that Ilúvatar took no thought for the void, and he was impatient of its emptiness, right? So, okay, I want to create things, so I'm going to go off into the void. But being alone, he had begun to conceive thoughts of his own, unlike those of his brethren, such as, I want to go and get the flame imperishable. This is such an interesting... Melkor is such an interesting figure, because nowhere more readily than in the figure of Ilúvatar himself are we tempted to map part of Tolkien's creation to established Christian Catholic doctrine, right? Yeah, okay, no one really has a Manwe operating in their pantheon. No one really has, like, almost pretty close, I guess, right? But like an Aule, a Yavanna, these characters are like a little different. They're a little more specific, but Christianity definitely has an Ilúvatar, right? It definitely has an Eru, but it also has a Melkor, because this is the Lucifer figure, right? He is the most gifted of the Ainur. If we take the Ainur to be a category of being not unlike angels, then this maps pretty closely. But the thing is that in its specifics, it doesn't map at all. I think that this is the greatest allegorical trap that Tolkien lays for us. If you approach this text thinking of Melkor immediately like Lucifer, then you are going to miss what I think is the most interesting part of Tolkien's cosmology here. The entire creation myth of Arda, that entire impulse which underpins the Lord of the Rings, the whole legendarium, is present here in a way that I think is deceptively easy to miss. The problem here is not that Melkor is improvising. We are all improvising. All of the Ainur are bringing the thoughts of their own minds, reflective of that part of the mind of Ilúvatar from which they were created, to this music. This is an improv jam fest, but Melkor is seeking instead to not serve the music, not to bring harmony and consonance, but to bring disharmony and dissonance, right? He is seeking to self-aggrandize. He is seeking to claim for himself more power and glory than he is actually entitled to. The specifics of Melkor, though, are complicated, right? To Melkor, among the Ainur, had been given the greatest gifts of power and knowledge. Okay, he's the best of the Ainur. He's the most powerful of the Ainur. That's in keeping with a Luciferian read for sure. But there's something very specific that sets Melkor apart from the other Ainur long before the music even starts, right? He is from the jump different. He is singular because he has a share in all the gifts of his brethren. Each part of Ilúvatar's mind is given form in one of the Ainur, but Melkor has them all. He is a jack of all trades. He is an Ainur without portfolio. He is able to kind of sense, to comprehend good things here, right? The comprehension of each mind comprehending the mind of the others, right? That is going to be part of the perfect unified music after the end of days. Well, Melkor's kind of got a sense of that. He's got more sense of that than anyone else. So this is this is introducing speculation. I should have a little theme. This is where I am kind of stepping off the path of most Tolkien scholarship and introducing an idea that is, as far as I know, wholly my own. Because I'm curious about what part of the mind of Ilúvatar is Melkor. He's driven right from the beginning, before the great music begins, of course, to seek the flame imperishable because he wants to create. Now, yes, he wants to create and he wants lordship and dominion, right? He wants to own things rather than just create things for the love of them. That is what distinguishes, as we'll see in the pages to come, that is what distinguishes Melkor and Aule. But he still wants to create. It's that creative impulse. And the creative impulse, as we have seen, is good. It is holy. The purpose for creating the Ainur is so that they might themselves have some measure of subcreation. Well, Melkor wants to create. Crucially, not subcreate, but create himself. And I'm raising this now because of what is about to happen, and because Tolkien is stepping toward the irresolvable problem of myths of creation, right? The irresolvable problem of myths of creation is simply this. Why would a benevolent, omnipotent God create evil, suffering, and sorrow? Or if you want to extend that, why would an omnipotent and benevolent God create other beings that create sorrow and suffering and evil? Because that is what is going to happen, right? Some aspect has passed into Melkor that is seeking to sow discord. What is the element of Ilúvatar that has become Melkor? Is it possible that Melkor is that aspect of Ilúvatar which is itself creativity? Right? As Manwë is connected to the air and Ulmo to the water and Yavanna to living things, is Melkor tied to creativity itself? Is that his domain? Is that the part of the mind of Ilúvatar from which he was spawned? Is that why he has a knowledge of all of the other spheres of responsibility that the Ainur have been granted? Is that why he has this driving desire? Is that why he seeks the flame imperishable? Is that why all of this happens? Is because when Ilúvatar instantiates each fragment of his mind in the universe within the form of an Ainu, that his creativity becomes Melkor, and that driving creativity seeks to create in a way that is refusing to be subordinated to the desire of Ilúvatar, right? Refusing to play its part because there is something rebellious within that creativity. And I'm reminded of the letter that Tolkien sends to Waltman that we pulled the slide from just a moment ago, where he talks in the very first part of that letter about the ego of the author, right? I'm going to tell you just I'm going to give you a resume of the events of Middle-earth so I can try and persuade you to publish them, because that is the thing that I want, right? I'm going to give you a resume, and then it's 10,000 words of this absolutely baroque and epic mythology. There is something in the mind of the creative force. There's something within the mind of the author, specifically if we're talking about Tolkien, but within anyone who has a creative spark within them, right? There is something there that wants to create and wants to spread that creation, that wants to be celebrated for that creation. We are all, I think, maybe just a little bit Melkor when it comes to that singular act of creation. So to extend this parenthetical even more fully, right? If a being with a creative instinct, that is to say Ilúvatar, creates a universe, and part of that universe is a reflection of the creative instinct, but that creative instinct is from the first thwarted, right? Because Melkor doesn't have the flame imperishable, he cannot actually create on his own. Is that the seed? Is that the original sin? Is that where all discord and disharmony, is that ultimately where all evil comes from? Because if there is contained within this a developed theological thought here, I find it absolutely engaging. I think that Tolkien is getting very close here, either on purpose or inadvertently, to a means of absolutely resolving this irresolvable problem of creation myth. I would love to know what you guys think about this. And certainly if there is any scholarship, I have looked around and found nothing, but if there is any scholarship on this, I would love if you could point me toward it, if you're familiar with any. But maybe we'll develop this. Maybe I'll I don't know, write a paper or something and develop this idea into a more accessible form than buried here in the middle of a 2-hour session on the Ainulindalë. So, this is where Tolkien gives us the real gift of this this mythological mode that we're studying here, because we're getting the creation of the song, yes, of the great music, but it is layered so deeply in metaphor, right? We're still in the perspective of the elves, refracted through the Valar, refracted through the Ainur, refracted back to the beginning of time and the origins of creation. Let's take a look at the response then, right? I guess we should study this just a little more deeply. I got caught up in what is Melkor's whole deal, you guys. It should seem significant, but perhaps we wandered off the path a little bit. So some of these thoughts, right? He wants to create these elements of the song, elements of the music that are his own, that are vainglorious, right? That advance his own standing amongst the Ainur, that increase the power and glory of the part assigned to himself. Some of these thoughts he now wove into his music, and straightway discord arose about him, and many that sang nigh him grew despondent, and their thought was disturbed, and their music faltered, right? So straight away, as he starts to do this thing that is not in harmony with the rest of the music, it starts to have this chilling effect on those Ainur around him, right? So their thoughts are disturbed, their music falter, but some, crucially, begin to attune their music to his rather than to the thought that they had had at first. And you'll note here too, right? This is not a battle between Melkor and Ilúvatar. It's not that the good and faithful Ainur they all have their hymn books open and they are singing the song that Ilúvatar has told them to sing. No, they are singing the song that comes to them naturally. They're singing their own thought, right? They begin to attune their music to his rather than to the thought which they had at first. He's kind of dominating their own creativity with his own. Then the discord of Melkor spread ever wider, and the melodies which had been heard before foundered in a sea of turbulent sound, right? It's destabilizing the whole music, right? It's destabilizing the chorus of the Ainur. Let's take a look then at what happens in response. Then Ilúvatar arose, and the Ainur perceived that he smiled, and he lifted up his left hand, and a new theme began amid the storm, like and yet unlike to the former theme, and it gathered power and had new beauty. But the discord of Melkor rose in uproar and contended with it, and again there was a war of sound more violent than before, until many of the Ainur were dismayed and sang no longer, and Melkor had the mastery. Then again Ilúvatar arose, and the Ainur perceived that his countenance was stern, and he lifted up his right hand. And behold, a third theme grew amid the confusion, and it was unlike the others, for it seemed at first soft and sweet, a mere rippling of gentle sounds and delicate melodies, but it could not be quenched, and it took to itself power and profundity, and it seemed at last that there were two musics progressing at one time before the seat of Ilúvatar, and they were utterly at variance. The one was deep and wide and beautiful, but slow, and blended with an immeasurable sorrow, from which its beauty chiefly came. The other had now achieved a unity of its own, but it was loud and vain and endlessly repeated, and it had little harmony, but rather a clamorous unison as if many trumpets braying upon a few notes. And it essayed to drown the other music by the violence of its voice, but it seemed that its most triumphant notes were taken by the other and woven into its own solemn pattern. In the midst of this strife, whereat the halls of Ilúvatar shook, and a tremor ran out into the silences yet unmoved, Ilúvatar arose a third time, and his face was terrible to behold. Then he raised up both hands, and in one chord, deeper than the abyss, higher than the firmament, piercing as the light of the eye of Ilúvatar, the music ceased. It is one hell of a mic drop. There's so much to get into here. I wanted to note previously in the last slide that Ilúvatar was happy at the first part of the music, right? As the music begins, he is happy, for it is without flaw, right? We're tying into the idea that this music, when perfect, will give rise to a perfect creation, right? That seems to be the logical consequence of both Ilúvatar being pleased that the music is without flaw and also this throwing forward to what happens after the end of days. So here we are. Melkor is sowing disunity and discord. Ilúvatar arose. The Ainur perceived that he smiled. He lifts up his left hand, and a new theme begins amidst the storm, right? So there's just this tumult, this calamity happening around the throne of Ilúvatar. But now a new theme comes, and it gathers power and had new beauty. It is different, right? Like and yet unlike to the former theme, but it gathered power and had new beauty. But the discord of Melkor rose in uproar and contended with it. Again, there was a war of sound more violent than before. Many of the Ainur at this point drop out, and Melkor had the mastery. And then Ilúvatar rises again and begins the third theme. Now, from where does this third theme come is an interesting question. If many of the Ainur are dismayed and sang no longer, and Melkor has the mastery, is there a small contingent of Ainur who are still singing their true and faithful songs that give birth to this third theme, right? It grew among the confusion. Well, yeah, because it's still everyone improvising, and everyone is now improvising in the will of Ilúvatar, right? Not under the will of Ilúvatar exactly, right? But we have to think of this metaphor of the light and the prisms, okay? Their prisms, the prism that is them, is catching the light of Ilúvatar properly, and thus unity and harmony flow forth, right? There is a music that arises because they are simply reflecting that light, rather than dimming their own light or diminishing their light under the will of Melkor. For it seemed at first soft and sweet, a mere rippling of gentle sound and delicate melodies, but it could not be quenched, and it took to itself power and profundity, and it seemed at last that there were two musics progressing at one time before the seat of Ilúvatar, and they were utterly at variance, right? So we've got the music of Melkor, all of these like unified trumpets, this brass fanfare just playing like the one note in 1,000 different voices, and then we've got this soft, subtle music of Ilúvatar, right? Deep and wide and beautiful, but slow. And to reference the comment that I made at the beginning of tonight's session, blended with an immeasurable sorrow from which its beauty chiefly came. It is not that it is a sad song and a beautiful song. It is a beautiful song largely because it is a sad song. This is Tolkien's philosophy being betrayed by his aesthetics, right? The belief that sorrow is beautiful is a fundamental one in the works of Tolkien, that there is a romance, a significance, a weight, an emotional consequence to sorrow and grief. We're going to have much more opportunity to talk about this even next week when we get to the Valaquenta, right? But already here, enfolded in the creation of the world, is this idea that sorrow and discord ultimately yield beauty, and that this is a fundamental principle of Tolkien's legendarium. I should mention, too, how often this part of the book in particular, but really the Silmarillion more so than any of the other published works of J.R.R. Tolkien, the Silmarillion loves to play with threes, with triplicate structure, right? Here we have, of course, right, the first theme and Ilúvatar rises, the second theme and Ilúvatar rises, the third theme and Ilúvatar rises, and the music stops. We keep enfolding these triplicate structures as we move forward. So we have the first theme that falls apart because Melkor is seeking to increase his own power. Ilúvatar rises, we get the raising of the left hand, right? A hand usually associated with, a gentleness. I don't know what to make of this smile here in this first line. This is, for me, an absolutely unanswered question. Why does Ilúvatar smile? What is the emotion that he is experiencing here, if it is even appropriate to say? Well, no, I guess it's appropriate to say that within the metaphorical frame of this creation myth, Ilúvatar experiences emotions, right? We were just talking about how glad he was, right? So what is the emotion that he is experiencing here? Is it joy? Is it satisfaction? Is it tolerance? Is it patience, right? Is he looking upon Melkor and thinking, my most favored and most gifted son, now let me show you what happens when you try and sow disunity in my choir, right? Is it something like that? I have no idea. Smiled is an unusually non-specific word for Tolkien. Well, it is a carefully non-specific word, I'm sure, but it is unusually non-specific all the same. So then there's the second theme, right? Like and yet unlike to the former theme. Ilúvatar rises again when that one collapses. The Ainur perceived that his countenance was stern. He raises his right hand, and then the third theme comes out, right? It was unlike the others. It is a different piece of music, right? The second theme, of which we are told later Manwe is the chief instrument, right? It's a development. It's an evolution of the first theme. But the third theme, the one that sticks, is different. And it is deep and wide and beautiful, but slow and blended with this immeasurable sorrow, yes, but it's also subverting Melkor's unified desire, right? The violence of his music is being enfolded into the third theme against Melkor's will, and he's presumably trying to push against it, right? He's using all of his improvisational skill to push back against this theme, but all of that improvisation springs from the flame imperishable that has been granted him. It springs from the mind of Ilúvatar in the first place, and so ultimately is turned to Ilúvatar's purpose. This is the violent music of Melkor, of course. It essayed to drown the other music by the violence of its voice, but it seemed that its most triumphant notes were taken by the other and woven into its own solemn pattern. And then Ilúvatar rises for the third time, and his face was terrible to behold. He raises both hands, and in one chord, deeper than the abyss, higher than the firmament, piercing as the light of the eye of Ilúvatar, the music ceased. I find that metaphor in particular just lovely. It is one of my favorite things that Tolkien does, and he does it so rarely. It's the same trick as he pulls in The Lord of the Rings when the hobbits wind up in the home of Tom Bombadil, right? You'll remember how awestruck they are by the appearance of Goldberry, and Tolkien relies upon this this metaphor that is not a metaphor, right? This metaphor that carries no actual what consonant emotional baggage, right? There's nothing actually being communicated by it because it is a very direct one-to-one kind of metaphorical linking here, right? That witnessing Goldberry in that moment is like knocking on a cottage door and unexpectedly being greeted by an elven princess, right? Which is not what's happening. And Goldberry is not an elf. Let's be careful about that. But it's not what's happening in that moment. And it certainly doesn't communicate anything to the average reader. And here again, we have exactly the same phenomenon, right? Deeper than the abyss, higher than the firmament, piercing as the light of the eye of Iluvatar. Well, I don't know what that is, but I mean, it sounds cool, right? It still conveys something, but it's a non-specific metaphor in a very peculiarly Tolkienian mode that I just adore. So the music now is over, and we know that the Ainur will not sing music of this sort again until after the end of days. Let's take a look at the consequence of this. Then Iluvatar spoke, and he said, "Mighty are the Ainur, and mightiest among them is Melkor, but that he may know and all the Ainur that I am Iluvatar. Those things that ye have sung I will show them forth, that ye may see what ye have done. And thou, Melkor, shalt see that no theme may be played that hath not its uttermost source in me, nor can any alter the music in my despite. For he that attempteth this shall prove but mine instrument in the devising of things more wonderful, which he himself hath not imagined." Then the Ainur were afraid, and they did not yet comprehend the words that were said to them, and Melkor was filled with shame, of which came secret anger. But Iluvatar arose in splendor, and he went forth from the fair regions that he had made for the Ainur, and the Ainur followed him. So, the laying out of the creative principle here that underpins this act of cosmological creation, right? So the Ainur are mighty, Melkor is the mightiest among them, but I am Iluvatar, and that grants to me the special condition of being the creative force in the universe. There is nothing that you can do, Melkor. There is no theme that can be played that hath not its uttermost source in me. Everything that you are doing comes from me. And no one can alter the music in my despite. For he that attempteth this shall prove but mine instrument in devising of things more wonderful, which he himself hath not imagined. And that imagination aspect there, I think, is really interesting because there is a discontinuity between what the Ainur can comprehend, what they are singing, and what will be. There is a limit each to their knowledge and a limit each to their imagination, right? They are improvising, yes, but there are still things which Iluvatar is starkly withholding from them, right? Well, as we'll learn in a moment, there are things that he won't tell them about, but there's also the suggestion that you're going to try and do a thing that you are imagining instead of doing, you're going to try and do a bad thing that you are imagining instead of doing the good thing that you are imagining. And in the pursuit of the bad thing that you're imagining, there will be a greater thing that you cannot imagine. And that limit to comprehension and creativity seems fascinating to me. What's equally fascinating in this section is, of course, Professor Tolkien putting his finger very neatly on the toxic urge within the masculine heart, right? That thing which has so soured our conception of modern masculinity, particularly in places of discourse on the internet. But we see it here represented beautifully, right? The Ainur were afraid, for they did not comprehend the words that were said to them, and Melkor was filled with shame, of which came secret anger. This is the souring of the adolescent male right here. This is what happens to young men who are not emotionally literate enough to handle their own sense of shame, and from it comes anger, right? This is the radicalization of Melkor. This is, and I say that partly in a joke, of course, but also because it's literally true. This is the radicalization of Melkor. This is the moment where he goes from a fairly harmless desire to increase his own part, right? A wrong desire, a desire that betrays an insufficient humility, yes, right? But here it begins to turn to wrath. This is the moment where it becomes destructive. Before, he wanted creation and lordship and dominion. He tries to get the other Ainur onto his side, right? He recruits many of them in the singing of his version of the music. But this is where it becomes destructive. He is filled with shame, from which comes secret anger. Let's move on and see the vision, right? I was talking about threes. I was talking about how often we see this structure of threes. Well, of course, we see a structure of three embedded in the structure of the Ainulindalë at all, because we get the music first, and then the vision, and then the reality, then the act of creation. Don't worry, we're not a third of the way through tonight's reading. We're a little over halfway through tonight's reading. So that's good. Let's keep going. But when they came into the void, Iluvatar said to them, "Behold your music." And he showed to them a vision, giving to them sight where before was only hearing. And they saw a new world made visible before them, and it was globed amid the void, and it was sustained therein, but it was not of it. And as they looked and wondered, this world began to unfold its history, and it seemed to them that it lived and grew. And when the Ainur had gazed for a while and were silent, Iluvatar said again, "Behold your music. This is your minstrelsy. And each of you shall find contained herein, amid the design that I set before you, all those things which it may seem that he himself devised or added. And thou, Melkor, wilt discover all the secret thoughts of thy mind, and wilt perceive that they are but a part of the whole, and tributary to its glory." So this is the second stage of creation, right? The Ainur have sung their music, and that music is a work of art, and this is the consequence of that art, right? We're not drawing a straight creative path here between performances of music and the creation of a vision itself, but that doesn't matter because the creative force and the creative consequence are still both present here. We'll note here too, right, how deeply we've been affected by the metaphorical layer throughout, because this is the moment where they can see light. This is the moment where there is sight. He showed to them a vision, giving to them sight where before was only hearing. But a moment ago he was rising and his face was smiling, and then he was rising and his face was stern, and then his countenance was too terrible to be. All of that metaphor, all of that we're now learning, not actually literally true at all. So this is the world laid. Oh, I wanted to call out as well minstrelsy here. Tolkien did not care for modern languages. I think I can basically say that like as broadly as possible. We had a brief discussion over in the Discord about him adapting. When it became clear that The Hobbit was indeed a part of the Legendarium, he decided to change tobacco to pipeweed, right? Anglo-Saxons didn't have pipeweed in the way that the hobbits are smoking in The Lord of the Rings and retroactively in The Hobbit too, of course. But he didn't want to use the Spanish loanword. He didn't want to use tobacco, which is all new world and modern. He wanted something that was appropriately Anglo-Saxon. So here he's using the word minstrelsy, which is appropriately medieval, right? We're thinking of medieval minstrels. We're talking about a group of musicians all playing together, all crucially, generally improvising together, because most minstrels would not have had access to sheet music and would not have been literate enough to read it anyway, right? Which is not to say that all musicians during the medieval period were illiterate, but many of them were. So minstrels would just establish a theme or a set of themes and then improvise around it, right? So Tolkien is using this word in a very appropriate sense, given the linguistic context of this subcreative act. What he's not thinking about is the tradition of blackface performers in these United States over the course of the last 200 years, right? The pre-vaudeville era is an era of enormous minstrelsy, where, generally speaking, white performers would don blackface and put on parodic shows for the benefit of the fee-paying audience, even into the middle of the 20th century in the black and white minstrel show on television, even up to, Billy Crystal inexplicably doing blackface performances at the Oscars in very recent years, right? It's a shocking and reprehensible cultural artifact, which Tolkien, well, let me put it this way, which another author writing at this time in history would probably have been mindful of and would probably have avoided using that word specifically, but Tolkien could not care less, right? We're going to spend a lot of time talking about tuna as we move through this book, which any other author would have changed. Any other author would have looked at that and said, damn, this word has fallen out of my creative language, my created language, and I should probably change it. But not Tolkien. He does not care. He does not care about the contemporary applicability of this word that he is using. He cares about its genuine and authentic meaning. And that's why we get minstrelsy here. So again, right? Within this vision, within this world that you see before you, you are going to see all the things which you yourself think that you came up with, right? You think that you had the idea for all of these things, and that's why they're here. But really, I had the idea for these things because I am the force creative, right? I am in possession of the flame imperishable. But still, you came up with them, right? You kind of sang them into being. You didn't conceive of them exactly, but you did realize them in a sense in your music, right? This is secondary creation. This is what Tolkien is doing when he is writing a book. This is what anyone is doing when they're writing a book or making a movie, right? We have not the creative power of God, but we have this subcreative power, and we can breathe life into a thing which is complex and beautiful and inspiring and offers consolation and all the things that art can do. The only thing that art is lacking is being. It isn't real. It's just a vision. It was just music, and now it's just a vision, and that's all that it is, though that's not nothing. Let's get ahead to the children of Iluvatar here. And many other things Iluvatar spoke to the Ainur at that time, and because of their memory of his words and the knowledge that each has of the music that he himself made, the Ainur know much of what was and is to come, and few things are unseen by them. Yet some things there are that they cannot see, neither alone nor taking counsel together, for to none but himself has Iluvatar revealed all that he has in store, and in every age there came forth things that were new and had no foretelling, and they did not proceed from the past. And so it was that as this vision of the world was played before them, the Ainur saw that it contained things that they had not thought. And they saw with amazement the coming of the children of Iluvatar and the habitation that was prepared for them. And they perceived that they themselves, in the labor of their music, had been busy with the preparation of this dwelling, and yet knew not that it had any purpose beyond its own beauty. For the children of Iluvatar were conceived by him alone, and they came with the third theme, and they were not in the theme which Iluvatar propounded at the beginning, and none of the Ainur had part in their making. Therefore, when they beheld them, the more did they love them, being things other than themselves, strange and free, wherein they saw the mind of Iluvatar reflected anew, and learned yet a little more of his wisdom, which otherwise had been hidden even from the Ainur. So as we discussed earlier, Tolkien takes this mythopoeic strategy. He executes this mythopoeic maneuver that allows him to have both a monotheistic universe and a pantheistic universe, right? And here we get another mythopoetic maneuver here. Why do the children of Iluvatar arise in the third theme? Why are they not in the music sung by the Ainur? Why are they not in any way a part of the Ainurian subcreation, right? The Ainur here have created the world, but they did not envision it as a dwelling. They did not envision it as a home for the children of Iluvatar because they are solely Iluvatar's creation. Well, I think because Tolkien wanted to credit the human soul to God alone, and not to this layer, this not to upper management, right? Straight to the CEO. That's what we're talking about here. That there is a sacred and holy tie between the children of Iluvatar, all the elves, all the men, and all the people who are reading Tolkien's book. There's a direct tie back to God himself, and not to some other fragment, right? We are not reflections of a secondary creation. Arda, ultimately, spoilers, will be created, and it will be a reflection of a secondary creation. But we, each of us, are touched solely by Iluvatar. We are not the products of Manwë, right? I absolutely love how this balances the rhetorical mode that we have been in recently as we've been looking at the creation of the music and the creation of the vision, right? How the Ainur are responding, and how we move here back, and we're reminded again that this is a document that is written, architected, maybe, right? It is a theme propounded by the Valar to the elves in the Elder Days, but that it is an elven document. So they are situating themselves here, the children of Iluvatar, right, as a special category of being, which is clearly, if we are to believe their document, and we have no reason not to, also part of Iluvatar's intention too, that the children of Iluvatar really are a special classification of being. They do not spring forth from the Ainur. It is interesting that they arise in the third theme, right? Because we can speculate that the third theme was not Iluvatar's original plan. The original plan is for the music to be perfect, right? That's why he is glad at the start of the music, right? He's not thinking that Melkor is inevitably going to rise up, or maybe he is, and that's the consequence for the smile, right? That he's anticipating this moment of rebellion. But it's possible that the children of Iluvatar were never intended, but were indeed a response to the discord. The children of Iluvatar, we might speculate, are the means by which Melkor's dissonance will be enfolded into the greater theme propounded by Iluvatar. More on that as we move forward. I'll comment here too that we do see again the idea that the universe is the mind seeking to understand itself, seeking to represent itself, right? That there is a diversity of being here. The Ainur, we might think, as Melkor will be jealous of the children of Iluvatar, right? Because of that special condition, because of that special status, because he had no part in their creation, we might expect the other Ainur to feel the same way. But of course they don't, right? None of the Ainur had part in their making. Therefore, when they beheld them, the next sentence could be, they were filled with wrath and vengeance and forever saw them as lesser beings, right? Further from the light of Iluvatar than they themselves. No, of course not. Of course not. Therefore, when they beheld them, the more did they love them, being things other than themselves, strange and free, wherein they saw the mind of Iluvatar reflected anew and learned yet a little more of his wisdom, which otherwise had been hidden even from the Ainur, right? This is another way of the mind of Iluvatar, all of the Ainur in this instance, appreciating the mind of Iluvatar, all of the children of Iluvatar in this instance, right? It's another way of kind of faceting out the being of Iluvatar himself into the universe so that it might enjoy itself reflexively and reciprocally, right? Absolutely love that. As a justification for the creative desire, absolutely love it. And then, well, then I guess we get the, further clarification on the children of Iluvatar. Now the children of Iluvatar are elves and men, the firstborn and the followers, and amidst all the splendors of the world, its vast halls and spaces and its wheeling fires, Iluvatar chose a place for their habitation in the depths of time and in the midst of the innumerable stars. And this habitation might seem a little thing to those who consider only the majesty of the Ainur and not their terrible sharpness, as who could take the whole field of Arda for the foundation of a pillar and so raise it until the cone of its summit were more bitter than a needle, or who consider only the immeasurable vastness of the world, but which still the Ainur are shaping, and not the minute precision to which they shape all things therein. But when the Ainur had beheld the habitation in a vision, and had seen the children of Iluvatar arise therein, then many of the most mighty among them bent all their thought and their desire toward that place. And of these Melkor was the chief, even as he was in the beginning the greatest of the Ainur who took part in the music. And he feigned, even to himself at first, that he desired to go thither and order all things for the good of the children of Iluvatar, controlling the turmoils of the heat and the cold that had come to pass through him. But he desired, rather, to subdue to his will both elves and men, envying the gifts which Iluvatar promised to endow them, and he wished himself to have subjects and servants, and be called Lord, and to be a master over other wills. And if we are identifying the underlying themes of the entire legendarium, boom, there's a big one. To be master over other wills is the ultimate evil, right? Sorrow yields beauty. Yes, to be master over other wills makes you a bad guy. Always, always, always true. This is, I think, kind of a challenging part for many readers of the Silmarillion. I think that maybe some first-time readers of the Ainulindalë maybe give up on this passage because it is at an extremely elevated rhetorical level, but the point that it is making kind of is almost a counterpoint to that rhetorical level, right? So there is all of space. This is the universe, right? Amid all the splendors of the world, capital W, right? Not the world, the planet, the earth, but no, the world, all existence, right? Its vast halls and spaces and its wheeling fires, right? The universe is vast. It is huge. And in the deeps of time, in the midst of innumerable stars, Iluvatar chooses a place for the habitation of the children of Iluvatar. He chooses the planet, right? He chooses Arda, specifically, versus the kingdom of Arda, the whole other universe. And this habitation might seem a little thing to those who consider only the majesty of the Ainur, right? You think about these incredible godlike beings and all of their creative power who have made this entire universe and how spectacular it is. Maybe you'll think this planet, not such a big deal, right? There are so many things in the universe. Why is this planet special? Well, because you're only thinking about their majesty. You're only thinking about their enormity. You're only thinking about the scale of their power. You're not thinking of their terrible sharpness. As who should take the whole field of Arda for the foundation of a pillar and so raise it until the cone of its summit were more bitter than a needle. They can build a cone, right, from the scale of the planet to the bitterness. Bitterness here just meaning sharpness, right? The point of a needle. They are magnificent, yes, but that magnificence isn't just manifested in magnitude. It's also manifested in acuity, in precision. They invest their creative power, as we see here in this. When the Ainur had beheld this habitation in a vision and had seen the children of Iluvatar arise therein, then many of the most mighty among them bent all their thought and desire toward that place, right? They go into, they invest all of their creativity, their secondary creativity here, into the creation of this world. It's not less special because it's small, because the Ainur are capable of terrible grandeur, yes, but also terrible acuity. Terrible, terrific might be a better way of putting that to the modern mind, right? Just huge, right? An acuity of power and scale. They can be incredibly precise as well as incredibly large. So that's our setup. Thus, our stage is laid. We have the Ainur investing their creativity into this world, this dwelling place for the children of Iluvatar, which is another way of getting to know and to love the mind of Iluvatar himself. And Melkor here, feigning, even to himself at first, right? Just the continuation of Tolkien managing to completely lay out the toxic turn that the adolescent male mind can take under the wrong circumstances, right? First there is shame, then there is anger, then there's pretending, but no, not really, because what he really wants is to subdue to his will both elves and men, envying the gifts with which Iluvatar promised to endow them, and he wished himself to have subjects and servants and to be called Lord and to be a master over other wills. We saw the shame, we saw the anger, and now we see the desire for dominance. Now we see not just the grandeur that would come, right? The glory, the honor that would come with having a larger part than was originally attributed to him in the song, but something much worse now, the domination over other minds and souls. So now we're going to talk a little more specifically about the consequences. Oh, right, because I skipped over this part in my excitement to get to the consequence of this part, because, of course, Melkor goes to Arda to kind of massage out the problems of the terrible heats and the terrible colds that he himself created through his discord, right? This is why this is not a perfect Garden of Eden. This is why the world is dangerous and uncomfortable much of the time, is because of Melkor's discord, right? So that is a consequence. That is a thing that has to be addressed, and Melkor goes to try and, ostensibly, feigning even to himself, to protect the children of Iluvatar from it. But that is not the consequence of the heat and the cold, as we'll get to right here. Now to water had that Ainu whom the elves called Ulmo turned his thought, and of all most deeply was he instructed by Iluvatar in music. But of the airs and winds Manwe most had pondered, who is the noblest of the Ainur. Of the fabric of earth had Aule thought, to whom Iluvatar had given skill and knowledge scarce less than to Melkor. But the delight and pride of Aule is in the deed of making, and in the thing made, and neither in possession nor in his own mastery, wherefore he gives and hoards not, and is free from care, passing ever on to some new work. And Iluvatar spoke to Ulmo and said, Seest thou not how here in this little realm in the deeps of time Melkor hath made war upon thy province? He hath bethought him of bitter, cold, immoderate, and yet hath not destroyed the beauty of thy fountains, nor of thy clear pools. Behold the snow, and the cunning work of frost. Melkor hath devised heats and fire without restraint, and hath not dried up thy desire, nor utterly quelled the music of the sea. Behold rather the height and glory of the clouds, and the ever-changing mists, and listen to the fall of rain upon the earth. And in these clouds thou art drawn nearer to Manwe, thy friend, whom thou lovest. Then Ulmo answered, Truly, water is become now fairer than my heart imagined. Neither had my secret thought conceived the snowflake, nor in all my music was contained the falling of the rain. I will seek Manwe, that he and I might make melodies forever to thy delight. And Manwe and Ulmo have from the beginning been allied, and in all things have served most faithfully the purpose of Iluvatar. So it is one thing to assert as a point of theological principle that trying to subvert the will of Iluvatar ultimately in the end is only going to lead to greater glory, right? It's only going to make more beautiful things in creation, even if you try and fight against the natural order of things. You try to not play your part, or you try to take too much for yourself, you are still ultimately going to be put to good use by the creation of Iluvatar itself. Greater things will come, right? So as a theological point, okay, we can sit and we can debate that in dusty libraries or in front of cozy fireplaces, right? That is an abstracted point. But here, the rubber hits the road. Here, we actually see the consequence of Melkor's intrusion into Arda, his corruption of Arda, his dissonance in the great music, and how specifically it has yielded greater beauty. Because he is the one that brings the cold, right? He hath bethought him of bitter, cold, immoderate. What a fantastic phrase, by the way. He hath bethought him of bitter, cold, immoderate, and yet hath not destroyed the beauty of thy fountains, nor of thy clear pools. Ulmo, right, who loves water, absolutely. He had fountains, he had pools, he had conceived of those things, he had sung them into the song. They are now realized here in the vision. But because of Melkor's cold, there is now more to the water than Ulmo could have imagined. The snow, the cunning work of frost, right? Water is now fairer than my heart imagined. Neither had my secret thought conceived the snowflake, nor in all my music was contained the falling of the rain, right? It's the cold to get the snow, the frost, the snowflake, and it's the heat to get the clouds and the mist and the rain. This is specifically well, this is not the entirety of it, but this is one of the things that Melkor's discord has brought into Arda, actually manifesting greater beauty. I love here, too, a kind of casual introduction to the Valar. We're going to spend a lot more time with the Valar next week as we move into the Valar Quanta, but I love here the bond between Ulmo and Manwë, right? In these clouds, thou art drawn nearer to Manwë, thy friend whom thou lovest. And Ulmo's like, yeah, this is awesome. I'm going to go and find Manwë right now, and we're going to make more awesome things in this crazy world. We're going to turn these negative things, right? The extreme heat and the extreme cold, we're going to turn these things into more beauty, into more loveliness. I should also, of course, call out, I don't know, is it gauche to have a favorite Valar? I don't know. I don't know that I care either. Aule is my favorite. The distinction that I mentioned earlier, what differentiates Aule from Melkor, right? Of the fabric of earth had Aule thought, to whom Iluvatar had given skill and knowledge scarce less than to Melkor, right? Aule is a heavy hitter among the Ainur, but the delight and pride of Aule is the deed of making. He doesn't care about the thing that he makes. He likes making. He gives it away. He does not hoard it. He is free from care, passing ever on to some new work. That is what is different. Aule does not need or desire dominion. He doesn't need domination. He doesn't want to accrue wealth. He doesn't need to be respected by the things that he himself creates, right? It is just a passion for the praxis itself, a passion for the art itself. Let's do the thing. I mean, we've come so far, it would seem foolish not to, at this point, make good on the implicit promise to create the universe. What do you say? Even as Ulmo spoke, and while the Ainur were yet gazing upon this vision, it was taken away and hidden from their sight. And it seemed to them that in that moment they perceived a new thing, darkness, which they had not known before except in thought. But they had become enamored of the beauty of the vision and engrossed in the unfolding of the world, which came there to being, and their minds were filled with it. For the history was incomplete, and the circles of time not full wrought when the vision was taken away. And some have said that the vision ceased ere the fulfillment of the dominion of men and the fading of the firstborn. Wherefore, though the music is over all, the Valar have not seen, as with sight, the later ages or the ending of the world. Then there was unrest among the Ainur, but Iluvatar called to them and said, I know the desire of your minds I know the desire of your minds that what you have seen should verily be, not only in your thought, but even as ye yourselves are, and yet other. Therefore I say, Ea, let these things be. And I will send forth into the void the flame imperishable, and it shall be at the heart of the world, and the world shall be. And those of you that will may go down into it. And suddenly the Ainur saw afar off a light, as it were a cloud with a living heart of flame, and they knew that this was no vision only, but that Iluvatar had made a new thing, Ea, the world that is. An hour and a half into tonight's broadcast, and my voice is finally giving up entirely. So this is the moment of creation, right? We'll note here again, right, as the vision is taken away from the Ainur before they're watching the unfolding of history, right? Let's remember that. But it's taken away before the unfolding of history is ended, which is partly, again, another mythopoetic maneuver here, right? A mythological maneuver to account for the imperfect knowledge of the Ainur. They don't know everything that's coming. They don't know everything that's going to happen. They certainly don't know what's going to happen during the dominion of men and the fading of the firstborn and the end of the world. They have no knowledge of that because they have not yet seen it unfold in the vision in front of them. But Iluvatar is the creative force, so he can breathe life into this vision, right? I know the desire of your minds that what you have seen should verily be, not only in your thought, but even as you yourselves are, and yet other, right? This is another example. I am creating something new that is not like you. This is going to be different from you, which makes it valuable, because different creative things are themselves valuable because of the interactions between those different creative things. This is exactly how the Ainur feel about each other. This is exactly how the Ainur feel about the children of Iluvatar, right? You are not like me. That's fantastic. Therefore, I say, Ea, let these things be. So the flame imperishable is sent off to be at the heart of the world again, right? The capital W here, the universe. It is not true, I think, that the flame imperishable can be found at the molten core of Arda when Arda later becomes a spherical planet. More on that next week. We'll get a chance to talk about that for a few weeks, actually. Suddenly the Ainur saw afar off a light, as it were a cloud with a living heart of flame. Maybe the galaxy, right? We might envision that as the galaxy here, or some kind of prototype form of all of being. And they knew that this was no vision only, but that Iluvatar had made a new thing, Ea, the world that is. And more importantly, or as importantly, probably, the Ainur can go down into Arda. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 slides left. That's fine. We'll finish this up in less than 2 hours. This is a piece of cake. This is a pretty short one too, right? Thus it came to pass that the Ainur, some abode still with the Iluvatar beyond the confines of the world, but others, and among them many of the greatest and most fair, took the leave of Iluvatar and descended into it. But this condition Iluvatar made, or it is the necessity of their love, that their power should thenceforward be contained and bounded in the world, to be within it forever until it is complete, so that they are its life and it is theirs. And therefore they are named the Valar, the powers of the world. This is our first point of inflection, where a subgroup from a larger population takes on a new name. We're going to do this a lot. We're mostly going to do it with elves, but we're going to do this a lot through the pages of the Silmarillion. And this is the first one, right? Some of the Ainur decide, cool, nice, great universe you've created, Iluvatar. Well, let's hang out here and sing some more, right? What do you say? I'll call up, like, I've got a karaoke machine. We'll jam together a little bit longer. But some decide to descend into Arda, and they are then bounded by Arda, right? But this condition Iluvatar made, or it is the necessity of their love. It's one of these two things. Either, and it's one of these two things, and the elves, crucially, don't know which, right? Either Iluvatar said, you go into the world and your powers are bounded to the world. You cannot leave. Until the end of the world, you are stuck on Arda. That's it. You're investing yourself, your power, your love into this place, into this creation that you yourselves have sung into being, and then I granted actual existence to, right? Maybe that's Iluvatar making that condition, or it is the necessity of their love. Maybe it's just because they cared so much to go into the world, they are bounded to the world. Like, it's not necessarily the case that there's someone, standing at the gates of Iluvatar's realm, outside of time and space, transcending time and space, looking at their watch and saying, nope, you can't come back yet. They're just so of the world, such is their passion for the world, that they enter into it so completely fully that they be within it forever until it is complete. So they are its life and it is theirs, and they become the Valar. We are not going to talk about the Ainur anymore, basically. We don't know how many Ainur there are. We don't know really anything about what happens with the Ainur beyond the realm of Arda, of course, because it is completely beyond even a kind of metaphorical conception for the children of Iluvatar, particularly post the events of the creation, which the Valar themselves witnessed. The Valar, of course, are going to relate this tale, as we'll learn in just a few pages' time. The Valar will relate this tale to the elves when finally they awaken. But all is not peaceful on the face of Arda, which we're going to talk about what exactly Arda is next week. We'll get like a better definition, a better understanding, right? We might be skipping ahead in our own like cosmological appreciation, our astronomical, appreciation of what, planets are and things like that. Much more on that as we move forward. But there is strife. Let's take a look at what happens when Melkor descends too. But when the Valar entered into Ea, they were at first astounded and at a loss, for it was as if naught was yet made which they had seen in vision, and all was but on point to begin, and yet unshaped, and it was dark. For the great music had been but the growth and flowering of thought in the timeless halls, and the vision only of foreshadowing. But now they had entered in at the beginning of time, and the Valar perceived that the world had been but foreshadowed and foresung, and they must achieve it. So began their great labors, in wastes unmeasured and unexplored, and in ages uncounted and forgotten, until in the deeps of time and in the midst of the vast halls of Ea, there came to be that hour and that place where was made the habitation of the children of Iluvatar. And in this work the chief part was taken by Manwe and Aule and Ulmo, but Melkor too was there from the first, and he meddled in all that was done, turning it if he might to his own desires and purposes, and he kindled great fires. When therefore earth was yet young and full of flame, Melkor coveted it, and he said to the other Valar, "This shall be my own kingdom, and I name it unto myself." But Manwe was the brother of Melkor in the mind of Iluvatar, and he was the chief instrument of the second theme that Iluvatar had raised up against the discord of Melkor, and he called unto himself many spirits, both greater and less. And they came down to the fields of Arda and aided Manwe, lest Melkor should hinder the fulfillment of their labor forever, and earth should wither ere it flowered. And Manwe said unto Melkor, "This kingdom thou shalt not take for thine own wrongfully, for many others have labored here no less than thou." And there was strife between Melkor and the other Valar, And for that time Melkor withdrew and departed to other regions, and did there what he would. But he did not put the desire of the kingdom of Arda from his heart. So, if you want to have hobbits, first create the entire universe. Which is exactly what happened, right? They descend into creation, but they're descending into phenomenological time. They're descending into linear time. This is the great resolution to the conflict between free will and a kind of predestination, a preordination by God, right? If God has already seen everything that will unfold, how can there be free will? Well, because God doesn't exist in linear time. And you do, buddy, I promise. So it seems to you in this moment that you are moving forward through time and that you are making choices, and indeed you are. But when apprehended from outside of the universe, right, we can credit Boethius in the Constellation of Philosophy, which you can probably make out on the shelf behind me, or could make out on the shelf behind me if I did not have so many words on this slide that you cannot possibly see either me or my bookshelf at this point. This is Boethius in the Constellation of Philosophy, who first the Roman theologian and philosopher, who outlines this resolution, right? That God exists outside of linear time, and thus to him all of your free will is happening all at once, and thus there is a ordered structure to the universe. So they begin and they start to manufacture the universe, right? All that there is. They began the great labors in wastes unmeasured and unexplored, and in ages uncounted and forgotten, until in the deeps of time and in the midst of the vast halls of Ea, out of all of this that is creation, they make the habitation of the children of Iluvatar. And who makes it? Oh, Manwë and Aule and Ulmo, air and earth and water. But Melkor too is there, and he kindled great fires, right? And you can think of this almost as an etiological myth for the, molten kind of initial form of the earth, great volcanoes and great, trenches of lava opening up when the world is in discord first, right? This is kind of the account that might be given here. This is an explanatory myth. Where therefore earth was yet young and full of flame, Melkor coveted it, and he said to the other Valar, "This shall be my own kingdom, and I name it unto myself." Not that I am calling it Melkor, right? This is not planet Melkor now. I name it unto myself. I am saying that it belongs to me. That's this moment. But Manwë was the brother of Melkor in the mind of Iluvatar. He was the chief instrument of the second theme. He called unto himself many spirits, both greater and less. Not greater and lesser than Manwë, because he is, as good as it gets, basically. But the greater and lesser spirits, right? Some of the Ainur who come into the world are of the order of the Ainur, right? We're going to get to this next week in the Valaquenta more than we can possibly encompass it here. Since I'm running so long, I will just say that there are also lesser spirits, right? We'll talk about the Maiar next week when we have better opportunity. And there is strife. And what does Melkor do when there is strife? He does the thing that every villain in Tolkien does, because, of course, this is not Tolkien like replicating himself narratively speaking. He is not just playing the hits here. He is recognizing that all of the evil in Middle-earth, ultimately, right, by the time that we get to The Hobbit, by the time that we get to The Lord of the Rings, all of the evils that we will see are reflections of this evil. They are all the offspring, conscious or not, of this singular evil. So the pattern that is repeated is the pattern of evil defeating itself over and over and over, because fundamentally the nature of the universe is good and just. But what does Melkor do? He does what Sauron will do much later, right? He slinks off into places unknown and broods, and does not put the desire of the kingdom of Arda from his heart. Let's take a look here. This is our last, I guess we've got one more. We really need to talk about the tumult of creation, but we do get this brief moment with the Valar first. Now the Valar took to themselves shape and hue, and because they were drawn in the world by love of the children of Iluvatar, for whom they hoped, they took shape after that manner which they had beheld in the vision of Iluvatar, save only in majesty and splendor. Moreover, their shape comes of their knowledge of the visible world, rather than of the world itself, and they need it not, save only as we use raiment, and yet we may be naked and suffer no loss of our being. Therefore the Valar may walk, if they will, unclad, and then even the Eldar cannot clearly perceive them, though they be present. But when they desire to clothe themselves, the Valar take upon them forms, some as of male and some as of female. For that difference of temper they had even from their beginning, and it is but bodied forth in the choice of each, not made by the choice. Even as with us, male and female may be shown by the raiment, but it is not made thereby. But the shapes wherein the great ones array themselves are not at all times like to the shapes of the kings and queens of the children of Iluvatar, for at times they may clothe themselves in their own thought, made visible in forms of majesty and dread. So the Valar take physical form, but they don't have to. They can go unclad. They can go essentially invisible through the world. And even the Eldar then, and not invisible in the sense of, Harry Potter and his invisibility cloak, but actually without physical form, right? They can shed their physical form and move through the world as spirits. And then even the elves cannot clearly perceive them, though they be present. Now, it's difficult to talk about gender when we're talking about Tolkien, because a superficial read of Tolkien might suggest to you that Tolkien doesn't actually care that much about the stories of women or, broadly speaking, female characters. Now, of course, I think that is an underdeveloped and somewhat unsophisticated read of Tolkien, but it is interesting here that we get a kind of gender essentialism, right? We get a very clear gender binary, and it is an even gender binary out of those Valar which come down into Arda. We get 7 of each, 7 lords of Arda, 7 queens of Arda, and 1 Melkor off to the side looking grumpy and plotting mischief. But we're told that these gender identities are in the Ainur from the beginning, right? Before there is anything, they have a sense of their own masculinity and femininity. And it's, I don't know, I want to read this as being kind of open to the idea that how one presents oneself does not change oneself, right? I want to be open to the idea that actually it's fine for women to wear men's clothing and for men to wear women's clothing and for everyone to just have a good time and be super chill about it, right? I think we can get to that. Even as with us, male and female may be shown by the raiment, but it is not made thereby, right? You can just wear whatever you want. It doesn't change who you are. But there's also like the implication there that you are what you are and cannot change. And that is a slightly more complex idea, right? Tolkien gender politics is such a loaded subject. It's such a difficult thing to get into, mostly because he was disinterested, not, I think, in women, in female characters, but because he was certainly disinterested in the exploration of gender, right? I do not think that the exploration of gender politics was a topic that ever crossed the professor's mind. So it's just not present in his work. And that can lead us to points where we are engaging in unsustainable speculation about what may or may not have been intended. But I choose, I think, to read this as an acknowledgement that you can wear whatever you like and it doesn't change one bit who you are. So as we see next week, yes, 15 Valar, 7 lords, 7 queens, and 1 Melkor, who is still, of course, causing trouble. Let me take away my camera piece there, right? Then Melkor saw what was done, and that the Valar walked on earth as powers visible, clad in the raiment of the world, and were lovely and glorious to see and blissful, and that the earth was becoming as a garden for their delight, for its turmoils were subdued. His envy grew then the greater within him, and he also took visible form, but because of his mood and the malice that burned in him, that form was dark and terrible. And he descended upon Arda in power and majesty greater than any of the Valar, as a mountain that wades in the sea and has its head above the clouds and is clad in ice and crowned with smoke and fire. And the light of the eyes of Melkor was like a flame that withers with heat and pierces with a deadly cold. Thus began the first battle of the Valar with Melkor for the dominion of Arda. And of those tumults the elves know but little. For what has here been declared is come from the Valar themselves, with whom the Eldaliae spoke in the land of Valinor, and by whom they were instructed. But little would the Valar ever tell of the wars before the coming of the elves. Yet it is told among the Eldar that the Valar endeavored ever, in despite of Melkor, to rule the earth and to prepare it for the coming of the firstborn. And they built lands, and Melkor destroyed them. Valleys they delved, and Melkor raised them up. Mountains they carved, and Melkor threw them down. Seas they hollowed, and Melkor spilled them. And naught might have peace or come to lasting growth, for as surely as the Valar began a labor, so would Melkor undo it or corrupt it. And yet their labor was not all in vain. And though nowhere and in no work was their will and purpose wholly fulfilled, and all things were in hue and shape other than the Valar had at first intended, slowly none the less the earth was fashioned and made firm. And thus was the habitation of the children of Ilúvatar established, at the last in the deeps of time and amidst the innumerable stars. I mean, this is powerful stuff. We do see here, I suppose, if you were interested in arguing that, in fact, you can change through the presentation of yourself in the world of Tolkien, then this might be a good example, right? Because of his mood and the malice that burned in him, that form was dark and terrible. It's possible that we're just skipping over a conscious choice that he's making there, but it's also possible that he is manifesting, which is a theme that we see through the rest of the Legendarium too, right? That evil things are dark and corrupt and ugly and disdainful, and good things are beautiful, to put it no more simply than that, because they are more in accord with the beauty of creation as it was first imagined. And then we get this last passage, and a passage that could not be more appropriate than here in January of 2025, that no matter what is done, destruction responds, that the built lands in Melkor destroyed them, valleys they delved in Melkor raised them, right? On and on, no matter what they do, that there is this constant opposition and a destructive opposition, right? Just an undoing, just a crossing out, a cancelling out of all that is being done in the name of the children of Ilúvatar, in the name of the firstborn in particular. And yet, right, as surely as the Valar began a labour, so would Melkor undo it or corrupt it, and yet their labour was not all in vain. And though nowhere and in no work was their will and purpose wholly fulfilled, and all things were in hue and shape other than the Valar had at first intended, slowly nonetheless the earth was fashioned and made firm. Nonetheless, the work of the Valar was continued, and ultimately, of course, bore fruit, as we will discuss next week when we get into the Valaquenta, and as we'll discuss, in fact, I have a slide for exactly that right here. January the 23rd, back on Thursday night, hopefully this time without any kind of audio problems, the live broadcast. We're going to talk about the whole of the Valaquenta. January 30th, we're going to do the first 2 chapters of the Quenta Silmarillion, getting into the Quenta Silmarillion proper. That's going to carry us through to the story of Aule and Yavanna, maybe my favorite story in the entire book. Then February 6th, we're going to get the Quenta Silmarillion chapters 3 and 4, which is a whole lot of Melkor in chapter 3, and then a little bit of Melian in chapter 4. Just a little dessert to help that particular meal go down. That is going to do it for this week's show. Guys, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for supporting me, which you can do, better yet, by heading on over to patreon.com/nextword, where you can sign up and get access to these live sessions. You can come and join me. Not these live sessions. This is not a live session. But Thursday's live session was a live session, and next Thursday's live session will be a live session too. And you can join me by heading on over to patreon.com/nextword. Sign up for free, and you'll be able to see the link that I post there around noon every Thursday, more or less. You'll get the link to the YouTube video, and you'll be able to come and hang out. You can also head on over to patreon.com/nextword and pledge me a couple of bucks a month so that I can buy new equipment and not have to re-record podcasts because of audio problems and what I think was a worn-out XLR cable. For those of you who care about such things, I'm pretty sure that was, at least replacing that XLR cable certainly fixed the problem. So if it wasn't that, it was something near that, and just a casual coincidence. The other thing that you get for heading over to patreon.com/nextword and supporting me is a host of bonus episodes. I've talked about a lot of things over the course of the last year, both for this show and the other shows that I've produced over there. There's another podcast out there that we're currently producing over at Nextword called Don't You Know Me By Now, which is an in-depth analysis of Richard Linklater's Before trilogy. We just wrapped up the first movie. It's fantastic. The show is so much fun. Very, very different from this. Very conversational and free form. That's a ton of fun. And we also produced over the course of the last year a podcast dedicated to the career of Tom Cruise. Not, I must say, because we really love Tom Cruise, but because we're interested in Tom Cruise's position as the title of the show suggests, the last star in Hollywood. That there will never again be another movie star like Tom Cruise, though there were many before him. That was a really fun podcast to produce. We produced 1 episode a week looking at his filmography in order from the beginning all the way to the end. And yeah, you can just go and pick your favorite Tom Cruise movie and listen to one of those episodes. You can find that at laststarpod.com. You can also, of course, turn money into podcasts by supporting me at Patreon. The basic deal is this, right? I have this old steampunk machine out back where I feed in dollar bills and like motivation comes out of it to make more podcasts. It's a really cool thing. I should show it to you sometime. But the product of that machine is that if you support me financially and help me turn this into a even more full-time endeavor than it is, I will eventually make a podcast about the thing that you love the most in the world, right? If you want me to do my long-awaited Discworld series where I look in depth at the complete bibliography of the absolutely wonderful Terry Pratchett, then I can do that. Or we can talk about, Brandon Sanderson or like the Mass Effect video games or any one of the million things that a return to Jane Austen is something I've been thinking about a lot lately. But anyway, I don't have to make the argument to you about capitalism. We all live in the world. Thank you so much for your support. Thank you so much for listening. I will also say that I'm coming up on the first bonus episode for the Silmarillion run, and for the Silmarillion run, I'm going to be turning the bonus episodes over to books which are very unlike the Silmarillion. which I think is going to be a ton of fun. We're going to look first at a Harlequin romance novel. We are going to look first at category romance, the largest and in some ways most influential genre market in the world, particularly in the Anglophonic world. Romance books sell so much more than any other kind of book, and the power of that genre is phenomenal, both within the industry and within like the cultural landscape too. I really can't wait. I have not yet picked the specific book that we're going to talk about, but we're going to have to talk about the specific book, and we're going to have to talk about Harlequin as a phenomenon, the idea of the romance genre in, the 21st century and exactly how that works, how we've incorporated queerness and LGBTQIA plus identities into what was originally a very compulsory heterosexuality kind of landscape. There's a ton happening in that space, which I find absolutely brilliant. And then we're going to look specifically at an example of the Harlequin romance in early 2025. That is not, I should say, going to be in any way, critical or sniffy or snide or superior, because I think that there is great work happening in that space that doesn't really get any critical or academic attention, and I'd love to really explore that with you guys. So if you're interested, head on over to Patreon to support the show, and I will let you know when I pick the book that we are going to discuss in just a couple of weeks' time. That is going to do it. I'm going to close out tonight, as I closed out the live show on Thursday, with a word from David Lynch, who will be so sadly missed, and whose words will be a beacon in the days to come. This is from Lynch. In Hollywood, more often than not, they're making the kind of traditional film, stories that are understood by people, and the entire story is understood, and they become worried if, even for one small moment, something happens that's not understood by everyone. But what's so fantastic is to get down into areas where things are abstract, where things are felt or understood in an intuitive way that you can't, put a microphone to somebody at the theater and say, did you understand that? But they come out with a strange, fantastic feeling, and then they carry that, and it opens some little door or something that's magical. And that's the power that film has. Let's all go out there and subcreate. Thanks for listening. I'll talk to you all again next week. Take care. Good night.